Hello YouTube, it's Casey's Lego and Diecast Productions. Thomas and Friends has a variety of characters that all fans love or hate. Here is a little question. Who is my favorite character of Thomas and Friends? I suppose all of you are guessing it's James, of course, because I chose him to make my OC. Yes, I love James very much, but he's actually my second favorite character. Maybe you are wondering it's either Boko or Stepney since I made custom models of them a while back. I like those two as well, but they're not my favorite. So, who is it then? My favorite character of Thomas and Friends is Henry the Green Engine. That's right, my favorite Thomas and Friends character is Henry. For today's video, I am going to explain why I adore him. We will start at the beginning. Henry had a really rough start at the beginning of his tenure. Let me explain. When Railway Series creator Wilbur Awdry created his engines, he gave each of them a real-life basis. Like Thomas is a LBSC E2 tank engine, Edward is a Furness Railway K2 locomotive, Gordon is an LNER A1 Pacific, and James is an experimental Class 28 from the LNYR. When Awdry created Henry, he intended to make him a C1 Atlantic, aka it's a locomotive with the 442 wheel arrangement. However, the first illustrator, William Middleton, did not illustrate Henry as the locomotive Awdry wanted him to be. Instead, he drew him as a 462 locomotive, very similar to Gordon. Awdry was quite unimpressed with the end results, and afterwards, Middleton was never invited back to illustrate another book. Enter the second illustrator, Reginald Payne. His artwork is much more fresh and realistic than Middleton's. His depictions on the engines have resemblance to their real-life counterparts. Unfortunately, Henry got the short end of the stick once again. Instead of depicting him as a C1 Atlantic, Reginald Payne drew him looking very identical to Gordon, with his only defining detail a copper chimney cap on his funnel. When Reginald Payne had a nervous breakdown and was unable to return, the third illustrator, Clarence Reginald Dalby, was brought in, and he redrew the previous two books made by the last two artists. Just like Payne and Middleton, Dalby also had a different depiction of Henry. He incorrectly illustrated Henry as a 460 locomotive. Awdry was really frustrated with the different depictions of Henry that he wanted to write him off the series. That is, until some readers asked him for more stories about Henry, that he changed his mind. When Awdry created his 6th volume of the Railway series, Henry the Green Engine, he wrote a story to have Henry involved in a serious accident, allowing him to be rebuilt into a 5MT. As this was a real-life locomotive, Dalby was thus forced to be consistent with Henry from then on. Since then, Awdry would invent backstories to explain the origins of the engines he created, especially Henry, and here's what it is. The origins of Henry the Green Engine is, in my opinion, the most unique and interesting backstory that Audrey had put together. In year 1919, locomotive drawings were stolen from Sir Nigel Gresley, the locomotive designer of the London and North Eastern Railway. However, the wrong plans were taken, and the locomotive built was so riddled with faults. The locomotive was Henry. He has a very small firebox and couldn't produce enough steam. The only person who was persuaded to buy him was Sir Topham Hatt, who at the time was desperate for any engines he can get for his railway. Because of Henry's small firebox, he performs very, very poorly, until Sir Topham Hatt solves the problem by letting him use Welsh coal, and it did the trick. Henry finally worked with no issue, until everything changed one winter night when he was dispatched to pull a fish train called the Flying Kipper. Due to a frozen set of points, Henry was diverted into a siding where he collides with a goods train. The damage was so severe that Sir Topham Hatt sent him to Crewe to be rebuilt. When Henry returned, he was a very different engine. He's a lot more stronger and more capable to pull any trains, like the Express. He can perform well and doesn't need any special coal to use. And that is Henry's backstory in the Railway series. Now I will talk about Henry's character. In the Railway series, Henry is mostly portrayed as a grumpy, selfish jerk. He was always acting like a jerk in most of his stories, which always leads to embarrassment. He stays in a tunnel to prevent his paint from getting wet and stubbornly refuses to budge. He, Gordon, and James decided to go on strike because they refused to shunt their own trains. He boasted that he is the only proper engine to pull the royal train. He and the big engines mock Edward on several occasions, despite the fact that Edward has always been very kind to him. He plays a trick on Peter Sam. He bullied Duck and the Scottish twins when they first arrived on Sodor. He told Percy and his 4 friends to get out of his shed. He believes he should have 2 tenders just like Flying Scotsman. I think you all understand now. Henry is a jerk. You might think that Gordon is the grumpy jerk of the Railway series, and while he is very conceited, but he has more kindness than Henry. Speaking of Gordon, one thing I like that Wilbur Awdry did with Henry is his dynamic with the Big Blue engine. The 2 big engines are like partners. They always band together and stand up on something. They mock James about his past incidents, went on strike, stand up against Duck, and most of all, they belittle the engines that are smaller than them, like Edward. Henry and Gordon are a great character dynamic, not only in the books, but also in the TV show. Henry's last story written by Wilbur Awdry is Super Rescue, which involves him rescuing 2 trains pulled by diesels, which is totally awesome. I definitely recommend this story to all of you. Now, let's go into Christopher Awdry's books. In the last 16 Railway series books written by Christopher Awdry, Henry remains unchanged. He was still rude and conceited as before. Just like what Wilbur Awdry did with Henry, Christopher Awdry pairs him with another character, James. There are multiple stories that focus on these 2, and Christopher paired them up very well. In Wilbur's stories, we see Henry and Gordon together, and in Christopher's stories, we see Henry and James together. In all of their stories, James and Henry often bicker with each other before getting their eventual comeuppances. In Cross Lines, James crashes into a signal. In Fire Engine, Henry gets separated from his tender. In Overhaul, the 2 engines double-head the Express, which leads to Henry breaking a steel tire. And in Sliding Scales, James pulls the flying kipper for the green engine. Henry and James are fun together, and their stories are definitely Christopher Audrey's standouts. I find Henry's portrayal in the Railway series to be kind of bittersweet. He was always very consistent and has a lot of fun stories, mostly shared with James and Gordon. But he was flanderized to one singular character trait, always grumpy and always getting his misfortunes. But he is still great. I truly love his backstory. If the illustrators had not messed Henry up, Audrey would never wrote the origins of him and the other engines. If the readers hadn't convinced Audrey, Henry wouldn't become the character we know and love today. Henry's portrayal in the model series is pretty fascinating because of how much the writers expanded his personality. In the first 2 seasons, Henry's episodes follow very closely to the Railway series. He stays in a tunnel refusing to get wet, he goes on strike with Gordon and James, he had his crash with the flying kipper, leading to him having a rebuild at crew, he belittles the smaller engines, he and Gordon get stopped by a cow, stand up against Duck, and rescued by Donald and Douglas. Season 3 is the first series where the production team write their own stories for the show, stories that expanded on already established characters in seasons 1 and 2. In this series, we get James's pridefulness of his shiny red coat in No Joke for James, Duck's wishes of going sailing in All at Sea, and Bill and Ben's bravery in Heroes. The writers also add a bit of development in Henry's character in the story Henry's Forest. In this episode, Henry has a very keen interest in nature. The forest is his favorite place on Sodor. He loves the place so much that he becomes very depressed when a storm destroys it. I really love this episode, mostly for the tone. First, it plays off with happiness, and then to sad and depression when we were shown the devastating scene of the destroyed forest. And when things return to normal for Henry, it changes back to the normal happy tone. However, this story is much to the disdain of Reverend Wilbert Audrey. I'll play you this documentary clip where he explains why he doesn't like this episode.
For instance, the video called Henry's Forest.
Henry the Green Engine has lived on the island of Sodor for many years. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
The story was about Henry, an engine. Henry is, in that story, is enraptured by the forest which he goes through. Now, what interest does a steam locomotive have in scenery? On one occasion in the story, the driver says to Henry, "We've made good time over the last section. Let's stop for a bit." Well, what responsible driver would stop as if he was in a roadside lay-by? You can't do it. They've shown a lamentable ignorance of Rule 55.
Rule 55 is a protection of trains when they come to a stand, reminding of the signalman of the position of your train, sending your fireman within a minute, 2 minutes to the signal box to sign the book and ensure that the signalman is aware of your position on the track. That's Rule 55.
I can understand his opinion, but I respectfully disagree with his criticism. I actually like this nature side of Henry's personality because it presents that he is not just a sulky, standoffish bully just like in the books, he is also a peace-loving, gentle giant. When Hit Entertainment bought the rights to the show, they drastically changed the format and characters, including Henry. The writers had decided to make him more soft-hearted. He is no longer being a rude and conceited engine like he was in the first seasons. He has changed into a friendly, gentle, nature-loving engine. Whenever Henry appears in a hit model season, he was given one spotlight episode. Half of them are focused on his interest with nature. In Season 8, we get an episode about Henry and a wishing tree. In Season 9, he does whatever he can to save his favorite tree. And in Season 12, he does the exact same thing again. This episode sucks. But aside from those, my favorite Henry episode in the hit model era is Big Strong Henry from Season 10. I really enjoyed this episode. There is no inconsistency with the characters, and I love Henry's rivalry with Gordon. Oh, and I forgot to mention something. Henry is paired up with multiple characters, and I think Gordon is the best character he is paired with. This is something from the Railway series, and it became very prevalent in the TV show. These two big engines not only stand together on something, they also face off with each other like rivals. Sometimes it's Henry who wins the game, and sometimes it's Gordon. Later, the writers retcon his not needing special coal, which is a change I got really confused with when I was a kid. Actually, I can excuse that little retcon because it's not the focus of many episodes. Also, the kind of Henry episodes that I love to watch are the ones where he struggles. Whenever Henry is put in a difficult situation, he is always very determined and tries his best. The episode What's the Matter with Henry from Season 7 shows Henry being ill again for the first time since his rebuild at Crew, and Thomas and Percy believes he is faking it to avoid work. When the two little engines leave Henry a very long train, Henry decides to pull it anyway, despite his boiler aching. He was able to keep puffing until he finally gives up. This, of course, is not a one-off thing. There are multiple episodes about Henry struggling, like the Season 10 episode It's Good to Be Gordon. While it has the Henry coal retcon, it's still a really great episode for how much it strengthens the characters of Gordon and Henry. Henry of the model series is my favorite incarnation of the character. He does act a bit inconsistent depending on the writers of Hit Entertainment. I still love him. I love all sides of his personality, from a standoffish jerk to a friendly, gentle nature lover. And I think he stands out the best alongside Gordon. Well, I have nothing else to say other than let's enter the animated world of Thomas and Friends. Henry is one of the characters who had the biggest changes when brought into CGI, mainly in terms of character and backstory. As shown in his flashback in Blue Mountain Mystery and The Adventure Begins, Henry was in his new shape instead of his old one. Most fans think that this is a continuity error and the animators probably don't know how to make a CGI model of Henry's old shape, myself included. But now I can excuse that change because the writers were able to make that work in the context of the CGI series. In Thomas and the Royal Engine from Season 24, Thomas mentions that Henry went to Crew to be repaired, but not rebuilt into a different design.
Oh, perhaps this is Crew, where Henry went to be repaired.
That's really neat, and I do praise the writers for adding a bit of continuity. There is also the Henry Cole retcon, which is the focus of only one CGI Henry episode, Henry's Happy Cole. While I don't appreciate the retcon made by the writers, I still love this episode, because Henry is portrayed as the very proactive character he was prior. In the movie King of the Railway, Toby mentions that Henry needing special coal was solved.
Henry's broken down!
Don't tell me he needs special coal again.
No, Gordon. That was fixed years ago.
It wasn't mentioned how it was fixed, but we all knew in reality it was Andrew Brenner and the new writing team fixing all the mistakes made by Hit Entertainment, including Henry's special coal retcon. Along with his drastically changed backstory came his new prominent persona. Throughout all the CGI seasons, the writers always portrayed Henry as worried and scared. Honestly, I don't mind Henry's new warrior persona, I only like it whenever it's done well. There are a few instances where Henry is scared of things, well, not scary. Like in the episode Ho Ho Snowman, where Henry is scared of a snowman?
I don't know. A snowball!
I hate this episode. In the 4 CGI seasons when Sharon Miller is the head writer, Henry's worrisome personality is only played off briefly in the episodes. But in the Brenner era, it became very prominent. There are multiple Henry CGI episodes written by Brenner, and his team involves Henry being scared of something. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes glimpses of Henry's classic personality shown through and through, like Scruff's makeover from season 17, where Henry agrees with Gordon and James about Scruff.
Dear, oh dear, such a messy engine.
Oh, I'd hate to be that dirty. If I looked that scruffy, I'd stay in my shed.
Another good example is Henry in the Dark from season 20, where Henry gets back at the other engines for teasing him.
Ah!
Only me!
As we all know, when Mattel rebranded the show in 2018, Henry was kicked off the main cast. Originally, the idea was to only write Edward off the cast and to keep Henry as a main. Henry was never meant to leave the series. But then Mattel decided against this and hastily replaced him and Edward with Nia and Rebecca. After Henry was written off, he was reduced to a side character who would rarely get any roles.
Not the station names again, Gordon.
The word I would use to describe Henry in the CGI series is good. He has a lot of great episodes, and he is very consistent throughout. But just like in the Railway series, he is flanderized to a singular character trait, always a scared virgin. The writers would try to make Henry scared of anything just for the sake of entertainment. But regardless, I think CGI Henry isn't all bad. Okay, now that we have gone through the history of Henry, why is he my favorite character? I love Henry because I'm related to his character traits. Just like him, I'm kind and caring, and sometimes rough-mannered. I also can get scared of things in my life. By things, I do not mean snowmen or flatbeds of fear or anything that Henry is afraid of in the show. Henry has an amazing character journey from start to finish. He was a pathetic, needless failure who changes into a big super Chad. But what I admire the most about Henry is how determined he is. Whenever he is put in a difficult situation, he never hesitates and keeps pushing himself. He would literally wear himself to bits until he gets the job done. Henry never gives up, no matter the cost. While the big green engine seems to have faded away from the show over time, fans like myself will always watch the classic show that made us love him in the first place. Henry is one of the greatest of the show, and he is a Thomas character I hold very closely to my heart.
Now, whenever Henry stops by the forest, he can see the new trees growing strong and tall. Sometimes everywhere is very quiet, and at other times Henry can hear leaves rustling or a bird's wing brushing the air. Often he can hear the distant sound of children laughing, and always he is happy here.
I'm not crying.